For 70 years, the forest looked fine from the outside. Rangers patrolled the valleys, counted the elk, filed their reports, and told themselves that Yellowstone was one of the last great wild places left in America. Then the riverbanks started collapsing. Then the songbirds disappeared. Then the aspens, which had stood in groves for centuries, simply stopped reproducing. And the old trees died one by one without replacement. And the hillsides went bare in a way that had no obvious explanation. The rangers knew something was wrong. What they did not know was that the answer had been missing from the forest for 70 years, and it weighed 120 pounds, and it howled. The forest that forgot its fear. Yellowstone was always the wrong kind of quiet. Before European settlers pushed west across the continent, the greater Rocky Mountain ecosystem operated according to a logic so old it predated the landscape itself. Wolves moved through the valleys in packs, hunting elk across river bottoms and open meadows, and the elk did something that seems obvious once you hear it. But that took ecologists a surprisingly long time to fully measure. They paid attention to where the wolves were. An elk being hunted by wolves does not simply get killed or escape. It changes where it eats, when it eats, and how long it stays in any one place. Open riverbanks, where a wolf can approach from multiple directions and an elk has nowhere to run, were avoided. Steep gullies and dense timber, where an elk can hear a wolf coming and buy itself a few seconds of advantage, were preferred. The entire geography of grazing shifted around the geography of predation, and the landscape encoded that shift in its vegetation, the way a city encodes its traffic patterns in the wear of its roads. Willows grew tall along the riverbanks because elk stayed away from them. Aspens regenerated in the open valleys because elk moved through quickly rather than browsing them flat. Beavers built their dams in the willow thickets, raising water tables, creating wetlands, slowing rivers into the broad braided channels that explorers described with amazement in their journals. Songbirds nested in the recovering vegetation. The river channels themselves were stabilized by the root systems of plants that were only surviving because a predator somewhere uphill was making the elk nervous. This is not a metaphor or an approximation. It is a mechanical description of how a wolf-present ecosystem actually functions. And it took the removal of the wolves to make the mechanism visible. That is, unfortunately, the way most mechanisms get noticed. You find out what something was doing by watching what stops happening after it is gone. The last wolves in the greater Yellowstone region were present in numbers into the early 1900s. Packs moved through what is now the national park and into the surrounding forest and rangeland, following elk herds across seasonal ranges that covered hundreds of miles. The system had been operating this way, with wolves as its organizing principle, for 10,000 years since the glaciers retreated. Land managers looking at Yellowstone in 1920 saw a functioning wilderness. What they were actually looking at was an ecosystem running on the inertia of a relationship they were about to destroy, and they had no way of knowing it, which is cold comfort, but is still true. The killing was fast and total. The federal government did not stumble into wolf extermination. It committed to it deliberately, systematically, and with considerable professional pride. The Bureau of Biological Survey, which later became the Fish and Wildlife Service, ran what amounted to a federal wolf elimination program across the American West from the 1880s through the 1930s. Hunters and trappers were employed specifically to locate and kill wolf packs. Poison stations baited with strychnine were placed across hundreds of thousands of acres of public land. Dens were found and pups killed. The program was efficient in the way that only a government with a clear mandate and adequate funding can be efficient, which is to say, terrifyingly efficient. The justification was economic, and it was not entirely dishonest. Wolves did kill livestock. Ranchers on the margins of public land lost cattle and sheep to predation. And in an era before reliable compensation programs and before anyone had articulated the concept of ecosystem services, The calculation seemed simple. Wolves cost money. Wolves provided nothing of measurable value. Wolves should be removed. You can disagree with the conclusion and still understand how people arrived at it. By 1926, the last wolves in Yellowstone National Park had been shot. The park, which had been established in 1872 as a protected wilderness, had nonetheless participated in and supported the extermination program. The rangers who killed the last wolves were doing their jobs as those jobs were then defined. There is no villain in a clean sense here, which is one of the things that makes the story genuinely difficult. The extermination was the consensus position of American land management for half a century, supported by science, policy, and public opinion, and the people who carried it out were not cruel or ignorant. They were wrong in a way that required a new scientific framework to see, and that framework did not yet exist. What nobody paused to consider, in any systematic way, was what the wolves had been doing besides eating elk. The question did not occur to people because the tools to ask it did not yet exist. Ecology as a discipline was young. The concept of trophic cascades, the idea that a predator's influence ripples down through an ecosystem in ways far beyond simple predation, would not be fully articulated for decades. The land managers of 1926 were not ignorant. They simply did not have the framework to understand what they were removing. The way a person without a concept of electricity cannot understand what happens when you pull out the wires. The elk, freed from the geography of fear that wolves had imposed, began to behave differently almost immediately. They were not obviously more numerous at first. The change was subtler, and as it turned out, far more consequential than simple population growth would have been. What the rangers started finding, the collapse did not announce itself. It arrived the way most ecological disasters do, quietly, in the margins of data sets, and the peripheral observations of people who spent enough time in the field to notice that something felt different without being able to say precisely what. Rangers working the river valleys of Yellowstone in the 1940s and 50s began noting changes in the vegetation along stream banks. Willow stands that had been dense were thinning. Aspen groves that had historically regenerated by sending up new shoots from their root systems were not producing saplings that survived. The old trees were aging without successors. A grove of aspens that looked healthy from a distance was, on closer inspection, a grove of old trees with no young ones growing beneath them, which is not a healthy grove, but a grove in the process of dying on a timeline measured in decades. The elk were doing this. Freed from the pressure that had historically kept them moving through riparian areas quickly, they were standing in the willows and browsing them back to stubs. They were eating aspen shoots the moment they emerged from the soil. They were grazing the stream banks bare, and the bare stream banks were eroding into the rivers, and the rivers were running murkier and cutting deeper into their channels. And the beavers, which needed willow to build their dams and survive the winter, were retreating from stretches of river where they had historically been present. The songbirds followed the willows out. Species that nested in streamside vegetation and depended on the insect communities associated with healthy riparian plants declined measurably across the park. The neotropical migrants, warblers and flycatchers that traveled thousands of miles from Central and South America to breed in Yellowstone's river valleys, were finding less and less of the habitat they had returned to for thousands of generations. By the 1980s, ecologists studying Yellowstone had accumulated enough data to describe what was happening, even if they could not yet fully explain why the elk behavior had shifted so dramatically. Wilma Subinski, working on ungulate ecology in the northern range of the park, documented overgrazing patterns along stream banks that correlated with areas of historically high elk use. The word that kept appearing in the notes was unprecedented. Nobody had a baseline for what Yellowstone looked like with wolves in it, because nobody doing ecology in the 1980s had ever seen it. The degraded state was the only state any living scientist had observed. It had started to look like the natural condition of the place. The science of fear. Aldo Leopold is the person most associated with the shift in how American ecologists thought about wolves, and he came to his position through an experience that he described with a clarity that is almost painful to read. Leopold was present at the shooting of a wolf in New Mexico in 1909, a legal kill in the era of extermination policy. He watched the wolf die and watched what he described as a fierce green fire dying in her eyes. He spent the next 4 decades trying to understand what that fire had been doing for the ecosystem. What Leopold intuited, and what later ecologists quantified, is now called the trophic cascade. A trophic cascade is the indirect effect that a predator has on species it does not directly consume, transmitted through changes in the behavior of the species it does. Wolves eat elk. But wolves also make elk afraid, and afraid elk behave differently than unafraid elk, and differently behaving elk have radically different effects on the plants they eat, and radically different plant communities have radically different effects on the rivers, the soils, the water table, and everything that depends on those systems. The key concept is what ecologist Joel Berger called the landscape of fear. A landscape of fear is a mental map that a prey animal maintains of where it is and is not safe. In a wolf-present ecosystem, elk carry this map at all times, and it governs every grazing decision they make. An elk in the open bottom of a river valley with willows on both banks is in dangerous terrain, and it knows this, and it eats quickly and moves on, and the willows grow. An elk without a landscape of fear is just an elk with an appetite, and it stands in the willows for as long as it wants, and the willows disappear. This distinction between the direct effect of predation and the indirect effect of fear is what took decades to articulate clearly. The early arguments for wolf reintroduction were based on managing elk populations through direct predation. This was a legitimate argument, and it had legitimate merit, but it missed the larger mechanism. Even a wolf population too small to meaningfully reduce elk numbers can transform an ecosystem by restoring the landscape of fear. The elk do not need to be fewer. They need to be nervous. William Ripple at Oregon State University and Robert Beshta began quantifying this after the wolves returned to Yellowstone in 1995, tracking vegetation recovery along riverbanks in areas with high wolf activity compared to areas where wolves had not established territories. The differences were measurable and significant, and they showed up faster than anyone had predicted. The fear was working before the elk numbers had changed at all. The decision that took 70 years. The political battle to return wolves to Yellowstone was longer, uglier, and more genuinely contested than the triumphant version of the story acknowledges. The biological case for reintroduction had been made clearly and repeatedly since at least the 1960s, when the Leopold Report, commissioned by the National Park Service and authored by Starker Leopold, Aldo's son, recommended that Yellowstone be managed as a vignette of primitive America and explicitly identified the absence of wolves as a measurable ecological deficit. That report sat on shelves and was cited in papers and generated discussion for 3 decades before anything happened. Bureaucracy, as a rule, does not move quickly on things that upset people. The resistance came from ranching communities surrounding the park and from the political representatives who served them faithfully, and the resistance was not irrational even if the outcome it sought was ecologically damaging. Ranchers whose grazing allotments bordered federal land had real and legitimate concerns about livestock predation. Their grandfathers and great-grandfathers had participated in or supported the wolf extermination because wolves had genuinely cost them cattle. And the proposition that those wolves should be returned over their objections did not feel like conservation science to them. It felt like the federal government deciding once again that their livelihoods mattered less than a principle held by people who did not have to live with the consequences, which is a feeling that deserves to be taken seriously regardless of where you stand on the underlying ecological question. The Endangered Species Act of 1973 provided the legal mechanism that eventually forced the issue past the political stalemate. Wolves were listed as endangered. The Fish and Wildlife Service was legally obligated to develop and implement a recovery plan. That plan, after years of public comment periods, political negotiation, competing environmental impact statements, and lawsuits filed from both directions, resulted in a reintroduction proposal that was formally approved in 1994. The legal fights did not stop at approval. They continued through the reintroduction itself and for years afterward, with ranching groups and hunting organizations challenging the program in federal court while it was actively running. In January of 1995, 14 wolves were captured in Alberta, Canada, loaded into wooden transport crates, and released into the Lamar Valley in the northern range of Yellowstone. A second cohort followed in 1996, bringing the total number of founding animals to 31. The releases were witnessed by ecologists, journalists, politicians, and protesters, a crowd that managed to contain people who were openly weeping with relief and people who were openly furious in the same square footage, which is Yellowstone in microcosm and America in microcosm, and honestly just the condition of living in a complicated country. The wolves moved into the landscape as if they had always been there, which in a deep sense they had. They found the elk within hours. They found the valleys within days. They established pack territories within weeks, claiming the Lamar Valley and the drainages of the northern range that elk herds had grazed without consequence for 70 years. And the forest, which had been living without fear for 7 decades, began, slowly and measurably, to remember what fear felt like. The river bent back. The changes started in the places where wolves hunted most. The Lamar Valley and the valleys of the northern range, where the first wolf packs established their territories, showed the earliest and most dramatic vegetation recovery. Elk that had spent decades grazing the riverbanks at their leisure began avoiding the open, flat terrain along the water's edge. The willows, no longer being browsed to stubs every season, put on new growth. The speed of the recovery startled the researchers who had spent years documenting the decline. Ripple and Beshta measured willow heights along monitored transects in the Lamar Valley and found measurable increases within 5 years of wolf reintroduction, in areas where wolves were active and elk had shifted their grazing pressure to less exposed terrain. The willows were not recovering because there were fewer elk. The total elk population in Yellowstone declined modestly after wolf reintroduction, but the decline alone did not explain the vegetation recovery. The geography of grazing had changed. That was the mechanism. The aspens followed the willows. Aspen shoots, which had been browsed off the moment they emerged for 7 decades, began surviving long enough to grow into young trees. In some areas of the northern range, aspen recruitment, the technical term for young trees successfully establishing, was documented for the first time in living memory. Groves that had been aging toward their own extinction were producing successors. Then the beavers came back on their own. Nobody released beavers into Yellowstone. The beavers arrived because the willows they needed to survive the winter had grown back, and they built their dams, and the dams raised the water tables along the streams, and the wetland vegetation expanded, and the songbirds followed the vegetation back into the valleys. Neotropical migrants returned to riparian areas where they had not been recorded in decades. The diversity of breeding bird species in the northern range increased measurably in the years following wolf reintroduction. And then the rivers changed course. This is the part that most people find hardest to believe, and it is true. The root systems of recovering willows and aspens stabilized stream banks that had been eroding for 70 years. As the banks stabilized, the rivers stopped widening and began to narrow and deepen, recovering a channel structure that had been lost. In some reaches of the northern range streams, researchers documented lateral channel migration, meaning the river had physically moved within its valley, tracing a path that better reflected the underlying topography now that it was no longer being controlled by the erosion of bare, unprotected banks. The wolves had changed the rivers, not by touching them, by frightening the animals that had been destroying the plants that had been holding the banks that had been keeping the rivers where they belonged. The ranchers were not wrong. The wolf reintroduction to Yellowstone is sometimes told as a story with a clear moral arc. The wolves came back, the ecosystem healed, the doubters were proven wrong, The end. That version leaves out the people who paid the cost. Livestock losses to wolves in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem after reintroduction were real, documented, and deeply felt by the ranching families who experienced them. Confirmed wolf depredations on cattle and sheep in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. In the years following reintroduction, numbered in the hundreds annually during peak years. Compensation programs existed, funded initially by the Defenders of Wildlife and later by state and federal agencies. But compensation programs require documentation, and documentation requires a confirmed wolf kill. And confirming a wolf kill requires a carcass in good enough condition to be verified, and livestock do not always cooperate with bureaucratic requirements by dying in accessible and well-preserved locations. One rancher in the Paradise Valley south of Livingston, Montana, told a reporter in 2004 that he had lost 7 cattle in 18 months to confirmed wolf kills, had received compensation for 4 of them, and had spent more time and fuel driving fence lines looking for carcasses than the compensation had come close to covering. He was not opposed to wildlife, he said. He had grown up hunting and fishing in country where wildlife was part of the landscape. He was opposed to being asked to absorb a cost that the people celebrating wolf reintroduction in cities were not being asked to share. That argument deserves to be heard plainly and not explained away. The ecological benefits of wolf reintroduction accrued broadly to everyone who valued a functioning Yellowstone ecosystem, which is to say to the entire country and beyond. The costs accrued narrowly to a small number of ranching families operating on thin margins in states where the agricultural economy had been strained for decades. The mismatch between who paid and who benefited is a real problem, and it is one the conservation community has not fully solved. The wolf reintroduction happened anyway. The ecological case was compelling enough, and the legal obligation under the Endangered Species Act clear enough that the reintroduction proceeded over sustained opposition. The ranchers were not wrong about their losses. They were simply outnumbered by a framework that weighted ecosystem function above individual livestock economics. Whether that weighting is just is a question worth sitting with. What the models got wrong. The story of Yellowstone's wolf reintroduction went viral in a particular way around 2013, when a short film narrated by George Monbiot described the trophic cascade in vivid and sweeping terms and attracted tens of millions of views. The film was not wrong in its broad claims. The cascade was real. The rivers did change. The ecosystem had responded to the wolves in ways that scientists could measure and document. But the film was more certain than the science warranted, and the science has spent the decade since quietly applying corrections. The claim that wolf reintroduction changed the rivers of Yellowstone is supported by data. The claim that this happened primarily and simply because wolves scared elk off riverbanks is more complicated. Subsequent research by Arthur Middleton and others found that the elk behavior changes were more geographically varied than the early narrative suggested. That in some parts of the park the trophic cascade was strong and in others it was weak or absent. And that other factors including drought cycles, the expansion of bison populations into some riparian areas, and the recovery of bear populations were contributing to vegetation changes that were initially attributed entirely to wolves. This is what science does. The first finding generates the headline. The subsequent findings generate the nuance. The nuance does not travel as well as the headline, which is a problem the science communication community has been struggling with for as long as science communication has existed. What the corrected version of the Yellowstone story shows is still remarkable by any standard. Wolves did drive a measurable trophic cascade across significant portions of the park. Vegetation did recover in wolf-active areas faster than in wolf-absent areas. Rivers did show channel changes consistent with bank stabilization from recovering riparian plants. Beavers did return without being released. The ecosystem did respond to the return of its apex predator in ways that went far beyond simple prey reduction. The honest version of the Yellowstone story is that a large, complex ecosystem responded to the return of a keystone predator in large, complex ways that researchers are still working to fully characterize 30 years later. That version is less quotable than the viral film. It is also more true, and in the long run more useful, because it is the version that can actually guide future reintroduction decisions without over-promising outcomes that may not materialize in every landscape where wolves are returned. The lesson. The forest. Kept Yellowstone is not a solved problem. It is the longest-running experiment in large-scale predator restoration that the modern world has access to, and it is still generating data. The wolves are there. The elk are there. The willows are there. The beavers are there. The rivers are there, running in channels shaped by the interaction of all of them. And the researchers are still walking the transects and measuring the willow heights and counting the songbirds and arguing in peer-reviewed journals about exactly which mechanisms are doing exactly how much of the work. What the forest kept, underneath 70 years of absence, was its capacity to respond. The soil still knew how to grow willows. The aspen root systems were still alive underground, waiting for a reduction in browse pressure to send up shoots that would survive. The beaver-suitable habitat was still there in the topography of the valleys. The songbirds were still flying the migration routes past Yellowstone on their way north. The system had been degraded, but it had not been destroyed, and the difference between degraded and destroyed turned out to be the difference between reversible and permanent. That distinction is the lesson that matters most for the landscapes beyond Yellowstone, where wolf reintroduction is now being debated. Colorado approved a wolf reintroduction initiative by voter referendum in 2020 and released the first wolves in 2023. The Pacific Northwest has had naturally recolonizing wolves moving down from Canada since the 2000s. Oregon, Washington, and California now have established packs. Each of these situations is different from Yellowstone, with different prey communities, different vegetation, different ranching contexts, and different political landscapes. What Yellowstone established is a proof of concept. It showed that a wolfless ecosystem is not a stable or complete ecosystem, that the missing predator leaves a signature in the vegetation and the rivers and the bird communities that persists for decades, and that restoring the predator can set in motion a recovery that no amount of hands-on management could replicate. It also showed that this is not simple, not cheap politically, and not free of cost to the people living closest to the land. The forest forgot its fear in 1926. It took until 1995 to remember. The rivers are still straightening out what happened in between. That is the story of what 70 years without wolves did to Yellowstone, and what happened when they came back. Not a miracle, not a simple fix, not a story without losers, but one of the most important ecological experiments ever conducted on a landscape in the modern world. Leave me a comment. Did you know the elk behavior change mattered as much as the elk population change? That is the part most people miss, and I want to know if it landed. If you are not subscribed yet, we publish stories exactly like this one every week. The next video is about a single creek in the Nevada desert that was declared biologically dead in 1983 and came back to life in a way that involved illegal fish, a retired government biologist, and a decision that probably should not have been made, but absolutely should have been.